We're live, guys.
I missed last time.
Welcome to the Atheist Christian Book Club. My name is James Walker. I'm president of Watchman Fellowship, an evangelical Christian organization that does research on new religious movements, cults, the occult, controversial doctrines, practices, and spiritual leaders. With me is our co-founder, atheist Bill Cluck. Bill, you want to take a minute and remind us about what is the purpose of the club?
Well, it's to get different views and to counter our biases and to study like Ken's book last time, which we thoroughly enjoyed. Have different points of view, and this time we have a Christian book, which we're going to have some good discussion, I'm sure. And speaking of books, our own James Walker has just come out with his book.
I would say that writing a book is the closest a man will ever know to what it's like to give birth. I know that some of you guys can identify with that. So it's as close as you want to find out what it's like to give birth, maybe. But it's
about Islam.
It's about Islam. It's what the Quran really teaches about Jesus. It's basically a Christian understanding of the Quran, and it's written hopefully to help engage in dialogue and discussion with Muslim friends, neighbors, etc. And we'll see how it does on that.
Great. Looking forward to it.
We have a book today where we, for our Atheist Christian Book Club, we're a monthly gathering of atheists and Christians who alternate books, atheist book, Christian book, back and forth, important books from both perspectives. And sometimes it has been, I think we can all say, it has gotten a little tense at times in this room, but always respectful and beyond friendly. We are friends at this point. How many's new? We have any new people here? So one. I think we have 3 others that are supposed to be here new. We'll see if they come in a little bit later. Our book for this time, we're going to be looking at the book Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace. J. Warner Wallace is a homicide detective, a retired homicide detective in the Los Angeles area. He's been involved in many areas of law enforcement, but for a number of years worked cold cases. And he's been featured on Dateline NBC numerous times. He's trying to take some of the tools that you would use on working a cold case and applying that to a very cold case of some of the claims that are made biblically. And he was a longtime atheist who became a Christian. So this is one of our Christian books on the topic. A Cold Case Christianity. How many of you got to read the book? Okay. How many of you got to watch the video? I gave a 45-minute video as well. So some of you did that. Excellent. Okay. Well, we're going to be looking at that as part of our club. And let me just say off the top, what are your thoughts on that? What did? Let's hear from a Christian that got to read it. What were your initial thoughts on it?
Before we do that, James, if I could, he will be part of the speaking crew at the Rethink Conference, March 29th and 30th. He'll be here.
Okay, so next year he'll be part of the Rethink?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. And that's going to be at Cottonwood?
Yeah, along with Frank Turek, Greg Kokel, Sean McDowell.
I think that month we'll just move our book club there and be done with it. A lot less work. So we have a who's who of... what day is that going to be? Do you have the actual day?
It's a Friday night and Saturday, March 29th and March 30th.
I wonder if any of those would have an extra half a day or something to want to do some either things for the book club or maybe for Atheist Edge.
We can certainly ask them.
That'd be cool.
Great.
Excellent. So,
In fact, I might even mention that to. Are we going to have him on live tonight?
we're going to have him on. We've got an interview where we took pre-questions.
Brady interview.
But it's
Brady
recorded.
interviewed him already. So yeah. So how many asked questions? I think we got them all in. The ones we know about, didn't we? How many of you had questions?
Yeah.
I know did.
And
Yeah,
Chris.
Yeah, Chris is not here, right?
I've got all his notes
Right
right
there.
there. So yeah, he's here in spirit.
Here in spirit. Is he here on Facebook Live?
Probably not.
Okay.
Yeah, I think he's got some things.
I want to also greet our Facebook Live audience. Do we have anybody watching?
Yes, 5.
Okay, all right. So I want to say hey to our Facebook Live audience. And what we do is we want you to be part of the club too. So if you have a question or comment, we monitor that. If you just in the comments below. And we will try to acknowledge that and repeat that for the whole group and get some input as well. So Not just from Christians, anybody. Initial thoughts on was it a unique way of trying to deal with apologetics from a different whole angle?
So what Christians, he said, what did y'all think?
Okay, let's start with Christians. Any Christians that read it? What were your?
Well, I'll just jump in. I thought the book started a little slow because I thought it was too anecdotal.
Mm-hmm.
But as I got into it, I understood how he was sort of laying the groundwork for his methodology, and I thought the last third of the book was pretty good as far as making a good case for early dating of the Gospels and the Gospels actually supporting each other as historical records. So I thought it was actually pretty effective.
Well, I might have to disagree a little bit, Conrad.
Why am I surprised?
The early dating, he has Mark, if I remember correctly, like in the late 40s. That's an egregious mistake. Mark, the traditional dating of the Gospels is Mark 65 to 70, then 15 years later you have Luke and Matthew in the 80s and John in the 90s. He just slams them in, Matthew and Luke too, really way too early, and he goes against the vast scholarly consensus.
I wish Tim McGrew were here. I don't believe he would agree.
Let me ask you, Bill, do you remember some of his reasons for dating Mark before Paul's writing?
The destruction of the temple, which is very vividly portrayed in the little apocalypse in Mark 13, as you well know, right?
Yeah, well, he does address that, actually. So.
Well, is that not a clear, what do you think, Ken? Isn't that a clear description of the destruction of the temple?
Well, he would argue that that was prophetic.
Prophetical.
Yeah.
Prophetic. Yes.
Well, remember that Mark deals with other prophetic things where he doesn't try to predate it. So he will say this is prophesied and then this is fulfilled. So if it was written after 70 AD and everybody knew it was written after 70 AD, he would have probably used that same formula. Here's Jesus predicting it, and see, Jesus was right. He has Jesus predicting it, and then he never completes the argument.
Yeah, I actually, that hit me as really a tsunami point. And I think we're ill-equipped to understand because I've read Josephus and did a bunch of work on the times. And the devastation Israel experienced with that temple took 3 years for the Romans to finally reduce Jerusalem to nothing. They cut down every tree and orchard around there to use for, for wood, for ballistas and everything else that they had. And it's just inconceivable that, when Paul wrote Hebrews, that he wouldn't have said, "Look, you stiff-necked Jews, look what happened." Or when Matthew was, casting the Jews as the villains for crucifying Christ, that he wouldn't have, just made that point that, now we've got evidence that the Lord has said, you're apostate in these things.
Well, first of all, Paul didn't write Hebrews.
Well,
The
point is, whichever author, and I think the other point that adds to some credibility when you think about that event is the fact that, often the Bible writers are accused of interpolating, adding things to the story as the translations move.
That's because they add things to the story.
Well, I think the point is, it's again a little inconceivable that this type of event that just literally devastated Israel wasn't much more pronounced in their writings.
Well, that's the Christian apologetic, but he just has all these assumptions like the Gospels are reliable. Let's take a scenario. You got a bank robbery, okay? Then the police come in and they start interviewing people. He would like this, being a big detective. And one bank teller says, "Oh, well, the bank door the vault was open when we got here." The other teller says, "Oh no, it was closed, definitely closed." Was there anybody guarding the bank vault? One bank teller says, "Oh, there were 2 Marines guarding it, and yeah, it was definitely guarded, and someone came down and zapped them." So the detectives were all going, "This is all over the place." Then they go, "Well, when did it occur? Was it before dawn or after dawn?" It was definitely dark when I came in. Oh, it was definitely light. You would just have no.
So you say the bank was never robbed?
Go ahead, Ken.
Or was the bank in Jerusalem or Galilee?
Well, exactly. It's
So there was no bank, or the bank was never robbed. Is that your conclusion?
Well, yeah.
Or the vault was shut, but it was left unlocked. Would they both be right at that point?
And by the way, there's a guy I kind of saw. There's a guy named Richard Carrier that spoke on this and uses this illustration. That's where I got it from. And it's a fantastic illustration. But see, here's the thing. The gospel writers always, and Christianity always gets the benefit of the doubt. Am I not right, Ken?
Really?
Depends on who you are.
I feel like it's the opposite of that. And I feel like everything you've brought up so far was dealt with in the book really well. And you're not refuting what he said, you're just like saying, and this is just crazy. But he actually gave evidence for his claim.
One of the things is he made the case that actually Paul is quoting as scripture Mark's gospel. So how does he do that?
That's just his
A miracle?
opinion. Yeah.
Well, and
Doesn't mean
Luke,
it's so.
Yeah, I've never heard that before. Most
Oh,
even
come
most
on.
evangelical scholars don't hold to that. I mean, you talk to Craig Evans or any of those four that responded to Ehrman, even though I don't disagree with them, those are real scholars. I
See,
mean,
here's the problem. Being a detective, he knows in a cold case, you want early witnesses. And so he's got to cram these gospels really early and go against scholarly consensus to get his point across.
But remember when he was doing the investigation, he was an atheist not wanting to do that.
Yeah.
Was he really an atheist, Jim?
No true atheist?
I'm not going to. If he says he is, I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt.
But here, what
He
we're
was a
doing,
very good atheist.
the analogies just fall apart. Here's the...
Holly Ordway was not an atheist, I'll tell you that.
Ooh.
Really?
Whoa.
Shot her.
I will know if it was cuss on her. I'm sorry,
What
Paul.
did you say?
Oh,
Not God's type we did a couple months ago.
By the
or last
way,
month, yeah.
Jim and Chris did a thing on the book where they take the parts of the book and you don't have to read it. They read it for you and give you a very objective, unbiased view. And it just, it was thrilling. I just loved every minute of it.
I would like.
I watched all the episodes.
So there are no presuppositions.
No, ask Jim, he'll tell you.
Hey, that book, I was expecting a whole different kind of reception of that book, and I was blown away. The things that to me were, I didn't even notice the points, and then they became major points.
Right.
And
The
it's the one
Christians
that,
didn't even realize until they saw our reaction to it.
exactly.
Right.
Just like the OJ thing. I was pretty young at the time, but I did not fully understand racism or the polarization between the races until the OJ verdict. When that happened, and America went right down the middle,
Right.
and I was like, "Whoa, what's going on here?" It's like an eye opener.
But you
have no
do
idea.
agree if the gloves don't fit, you must acquit.
I'm sorry to start
What are
that
you
going on.
So, Jim,
what you're trying to make about
He could've put that
Christians
glove on.
get
That-
what now?
That when the believers in this group, when they saw the reaction we had to Ordway's book, because they, the believers read the
Things
book
that
and
stood
said,
out to us.
and thought, oh, okay, they had a certain opinion of it. They didn't understand we would have such a visceral reaction to it, and so it was kind of an eye opener for you all to. And
How
then
it
when we
made
explain
us-
ourselves, it was an eye opener, yeah.
Well, and here's
I don't
the,
want to digress, but I am very curious on your statement, Jim.
Exactly.
You really think that she was not a philosophical?
Yeah, you're gonna have to watch my 7-part series on atheist. I don't. Yeah.
Let me say it's on the Atheist Edge podcast.
If there's a
and-
playlist, you can see all 7 sections right there in a row.
Right, but would you mind giving me like the 30-second or 1 minute?
Okay, the entire book. She says I read all the big atheist authors. That's as deep in the weeds as she ever got. Didn't name one. Didn't give any. She talked about the Kalam for like an entire chapter, but never gave
I think
her
she-
as an atheist her view of the Kalam. She just talked about how compelling it was for.
I think she was just a bad writer.
well,
She's an English teacher.
She's an English professor.
so anyway, back to this.
That's no excuse.
Back to this one,
Technically,
Jim. You're
maybe
gonna
good, but
It wasn't that well written.
No, it wasn't.
you're gonna do this book, right?
Yes.
You do that commentary. I
So-
love that
It
format.
was dry.
So I'm cheating because I've only skimmed the book, but Chris, the guy I'm gonna do the series with, he took 30 notes already, so I'm gonna be channeling him tonight. But this particular one, if I can just, I'll shut up in a minute, I promise. You were talking about Richard Carrier. Here's his view. I just pulled it up. His view
Please,
on
this
Wallace.
is from on high.
Yep. All right. Now, the way he words it here, I would probably word it a little differently. He says, similarly, Wallace claims to be a cold case detective. What he means is Wallace is a cold case detective, and based on that, he not only does he not interview any rebuttal witnesses, he doesn't review any rebuttal witnesses, he doesn't fact check anything with experts of the requisite specialty. He literally just believes anonymous written testimonies that show deliberate collaboration. And I'll stop.
Absolutely.
There's a
And
lot more of it.
he believes Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, and Luke. I mean, nobody believes that anymore. These were.
I take issue with that. And I hate to invoke McGrew again, but there are people.
Another one.
No, but there are people that do believe
It's
that.
not
Well,
mainstream
most people
I mean,
consensus,
there's
though, right?
scholars that believe that. If you disagree, that's fine.
That it was written anonymously. They didn't have Matthew, Luke attached to the gospel.
Well, we're familiar with that theory. We're just saying that
Yeah.
it's not unanimous theory.
Well, and just say that the whole rebuttal thing is, I mean, he quoted Josephus, Dallas, Julius Africanus. I mean, that I gotta really push back on Carrier on that because he did go to non-believers, and non-believers were saying nothing that contradicted the biblical accounts.
Really?
Yeah, really. That's his whole claim. He gave, and I've read those accounts as well.
Well, he draws analogies there. Let me give an example. He said, and this was interesting. By the way, I enjoyed the book because of the detective stuff. Like, did you all find it fascinating? There's 3 reasons why people commit murder: financial gain, power, and sex.
Well, why am I about to kill you? That's
But
Obviously, a fourth reason.
like the book we read before,
Or obnoxiousness.
with Holly Ordway, she became a Christian because of belonging. Because people said you can join our group. We like you, and its community is a reason. Has nothing to
Are
do
you a
with what it's
psychologist
talking
too now?
about. Oh, I did go to graduate school in psychology.
I'm wondering why you're so emotional
Take the whole day
about
and
this.
express.
Because it just when someone just has such deeply flawed arguments. Go ahead.
Before we move
Yeah,
on
no.
from the idea that the 3 motives for all criminal behavior, which of those 3 did the 11 disciples and Paul do what they did for? Why did they give up everything?
Who knows?
Well,
You can't interview them.
which of those 3?
Why did 900 people drink poison Kool-Aid in
Could you call it delusion?
'Cause
They were deluded, or they
I would call
just
it eyewitness accounts.
So the argument is that they actually believed it, not that it was right. But
Right.
my pushback.
Well, they didn't do it for sex,
is-
power, or money. That's the point.
But my-
Because they got none of the
You can
above.
come here if you want. Just move up to the front. That is a good question. You get to move to the front.
But my pushback is.
Looks like we're waiting for Jesus or something.
Justin's got something.
Oh, okay.
Oh, look, is that seat empty?
Yeah, yeah.
We actually know of people, and I can't remember if this was addressed in the book. I really couldn't. But we know of people who lie and say, "No, I murdered that girl," just for the fame. So it seems like, I don't know, that is kind of a pushback against my position to me, because people will lie even though they know it's not true. The argument is that you'll be killed for it, but these people are put on death row a lot of times. So I don't know.
Well,
if
the
the-
best-
You're talking about false confession. False
Yes,
confession.
that's exactly what I'm
The
saying.
best scholarship is Gerd Luderman, the German scholar, who says that Peter was very grieved. When people are grieved and go through an emotional crisis, he denied him 3 times, so you don't know what he's going through. And then they see a vision. They see things that aren't there. He probably thought he saw Jesus, and he told others, and they passed the story along. And it's called legend. Embellishment.
Conjecture.
Yeah, that's not as good of an
Yep.
argument to me.
That's Gerd Luderman, the supreme scholar, and one of the most
Fine, in
respected scholars
psychology, we
in
just
the
don't
world.
see that a mass hallucination. You could say one thing about
I
Paul,
know, that's
but
the-
also Paul had no reason to grieve. But I'm saying, like, we do see people lie and face death,
Of course.
even though they are, even though they know it's not true. So that's, to me, a better argument
Let's see,
against.
Christians set up straw men like the mass hallucination thing, the swoon theory that he really didn't die. He just,
Yeah.
yeah, and then they
These all
go.
Christian
And,
inventions?
I don't think Christians
No,
invented those.
no,
That's Islam.
but what I'm saying is they go and knock those down. They go, oh, well, it must be that he rose from the dead. Okay, look, Christianity is the ultimate cold case. For one thing, you don't have a body. So there's no body to
We rest our case.
Okay, and he goes,
Changes
and I
on a roll
thought,
tonight.
again, this was a good point. Circumstantial evidence, he said, everybody says that's a bad thing. It's not, it's a good thing.
Yeah.
So, do we have a crime scene here? We don't. We don't even know where the empty tomb is. Okay? We don't have any like the Roman person putting the spear through Jesus. We don't have the spear.
Well, we don't know where the tomb was, but they did.
We don't know that.
Everybody okay?
The people that knew didn't care, and the people that cared did.
So this is where I
Is
wanted
this
to.
Go ahead.
where they have respectful discussions, or did I come to the wrong place?
So I think that, to me, the most important issue is how do we go about determining what happened in the past? And historians work based on certain principles, certain sets of criteria based on probabilities. Like, you know, if you have something to lose, or if people generally don't die for what they know is untrue. You know, that's kind of a sort of something that we know from experience. That, but you know, maybe 1 out of a million people would. So maybe there's a 99.99% chance that you're right that people don't do that. Or you might say that people who are eyewitnesses are better placed to tell the truth than people who live generations later. So these are principles, you know, rules of thumb, and our experience shows that they're generally true, but they all have probabilities attached to them. They're not, none of them are 100%, right? So if you're counting probabilities, and that's the way history works, because we weren't there, we don't have video cameras, we can't see exactly what happened. So every statement, every finding that's made, or every conjecture is based on certain probabilities. When it comes to something like the resurrection, we know that from experience that everybody that we know has died, hasn't come back up out of the grave. So maybe in history somebody could argue that, oh, half a dozen people, you know, Lazarus, the widow of Nain, or, you know, certain people came back to life. But still, over the course of, you know, billions of people who've lived and died, coming back to life is a probability that's near zero.
They all stay dead.
Right, right. So when you construct a historical account that comes to the conclusion that is the least probable of all conclusions, then you need to go back and check the probabilities that are, so if you have a 99% chance that, okay, there was an empty tomb, well, maybe there's a 1% chance that it wasn't an empty tomb. So that 1% wiggle room is a greater area of wiggle room than the idea that Jesus rose from the dead. So historically, he might have risen from the dead. I'm not denying that. He might have risen from the dead, but the historical method cannot demonstrate that, because everything leading up to that is based on rational probability.
But there are clues, like for instance, the feeding of the 5,000, or was that the feeding of the 4,000? In 2 chapters, they contradict themselves. One has.
Or it was 2 events.
2 different events.
That's the Christian apology. But I'll tell you why it's not 2 events. Is what did the disciples say at the second feeding? Gosh, Jesus, how are we going to feed all these people? You know, that doesn't make any sense. He just saw them feed. He just saw Jesus feed 4,000. Why would you say that? Why are the disciples as dumb as a bag of rocks? I mean, it just makes no sense. Now, the Christians would say, and I think he said that, oh, well, it makes sense because they had a big rain and it was the season for the harvest. So, and they had barley which fits and so forth, and the grass was green. These little incidental. He's a big believer in the incidental, you know, consequences too. But it's just so, and there's just like marks of this being fiction. Like for instance, when Jesus meets Peter, they immediately drop their nets and follow him. Who does that? You know, no, that's just not reality.
He addresses that in the book.
I think he addresses that in the book.
What's his excuse?
I think that's a strong.
Oh yeah, but he met him sooner. Okay.
Right, because that's why the Gospels, one affirms by putting details the other doesn't. By itself, you don't. How can you meet somebody?
But again, I would say we're trying to judge with our constructs and not what those people lived and breathed and believed. That those societies were superstitious in the idea of miracles and events and signs that were given.
Yeah.
That was inculcated in the religions and beliefs.
They saw a demon behind every tree.
So when they raised those nets that they had been fishing on as experienced fishermen for the days or whatever, and the ships were almost drug under the water, that was a sign that had to be followed. So it's not unreasonable.
Oh yeah, that's what he
back
said.
to what Ken
Yeah.
said. I understand your point on that no matter how improbable it is, or because it's so improbable, rather you have to go back and relook at that. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, and I would agree with you, you cannot prove using historical methods these kinds of things. If, in a best case scenario, let's say there really was a resurrection that really did take place, and people really, really wanted to communicate it in a way where centuries later we could see the truth of it. Can you even imagine how they could have written it any better in such a way that it would be, that you could be able to test it? Because you're still dealing with a miracle, which rarely happens.
Right. Well, again, that conclusion is inaccessible from a historical perspective. So the only way is that Jesus were to actually come and present himself to us today. Because of the low probabilities involved when you're talking about the historical method.
Contemporary autographs and multiple people writing it from that location that don't have a dog in the fight. Romans, Greeks.
Right, hostile witnesses. We have nothing. It's all
that's what I would
Christian
like
propaganda.
to see.
They had a
You asked what I'd
theological
like to see.
axe to grind.
Oh, yeah.
More contemporary,
So
like
you have
actual
Joseph.
autographs, not copies, and someone, a third party, unbiased. What's the word?
So
I'm
if
talking to fight.
Christians want to really get this and communicate it, they need to find people who don't believe it and get them to write their books.
Someone who doesn't believe, someone who's not in their group.
So Josephus.
Well, I know, but that's
so what of
Josephus.
Josephus?
Most of the eyewitnesses.
What about
haven't-
Josephus?
So Josephus not only mentions Christ twice, and once through
Once.
the brother James, which he spent
He only
more
mentions
time
him once.
talking about James,
In the
and John the
90s.
Baptist, and Josephus is an accredited historian for that period of
But
time.
Josephus doesn't tell us anything but a normal Christian wouldn't have known. He
The-
says he was a great guy that, died.
One-
Well, you say
You're-
he's a hostile witness.
you're-
Would you-
you're-
Yeah,
looking-
absolutely. There's no doubt about
So,
that.
so that's someone who was active a bare 20 to 25 years after the death of Christ. He documents all of the Roman procurers and the high priests.
Well, first of all, that
So,
whole passage,
you know.
according to people like Richard Carrier,
Yeah.
was a total interpolation.
Well, there
No,
was three passages
no,
and two.
no,
You did
not
two
total.
are,
No, Richard Carrier says it was an interpolation.
Well,
That's-
one of them is certainly an interpolation.
But the one that we can all agree is legitimate, genuine,
Is the second one.
has him listed. It's in their Watchmen. They do a thing on it.
Okay.
You could-
So
a profile on
Is
it.
the one where James, the brother of Jesus,
Yes,
Exactly.
and Ananias,
Yeah,
and he
yeah.
just lists all these historical characters.
Right.
And that would be Josephus is a good.
But Josephus affirms the fact that Jesus had a brother, and then Richard Carrier can still look at that and say there was no such thing as a Jesus. Why does his brother not know this?
Oh, he says it wasn't the brother of
It
Jesus.
comes. I've talked
You know
to
that,
him
yeah.
about it, and it all comes down to the actual translation, the meaning of brother of the Lord. I think.
Gosh, I wish we had him
He-
here.
he
Wouldn't
did-
that be great if we had Richard Carrier here? No.
So, I
Anyway,
mean, Josephus was writing in the 90s, so.
Oh, do you have a question?
No. He wrote two of the books. One of them he wrote within about 20 years after he got back to
Well,
Rome.
whatever, Neil. We
Yeah.
want contemporary witnesses that are not.
He was there. He was captured by Titus and taken.
Well, he wasn't there when Jesus got crucified.
I mean, how close can you get?
We want close. Yeah, we want close.
Like actual a first-hand witness would be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
But Josephus,
We
one
got a
good,
couple.
one thing on your defense, I'm going to come to your a little.
Ooh.
I'm going to
Thank you.
concede something. Josephus would be a kind of treated as a third-party, unbiased witness, like I'm talking about, because why? He stayed a Jew.
Well, no,
He never
nobody's
converted to
disputing that.
Christianity, did he?
No. But if you read Bart Ehrman's book,
So he
that
talked about
Jesus
Jesus.
exists, he says he's not telling us anything that anybody else wouldn't have known, any Christian on the street.
Matthew,
wouldn't
Mark,
have.
Luke, and John.
Yeah.
You know why
There you go.
I don't think you would believe them though, Bill? It's because, stop and think about how often you talk about the real scholars. The real scholars are always only the ones that you agree with. And
Absolutely.
you dismiss out of hand those that you don't agree with.
Yeah.
I think you would do the same thing for people writing at that time. I think if they didn't
You
say
say I'm
something you
biased.
agreed with, you would just kind of dismiss them.
I want to say something in favor of the Christian narrative,
Oh,
or
yeah.
against the common
All these
skeptical.
Christians. Are you getting all this on camera? All right.
Everybody be quiet, kids talking.
So I've never been one who joins in with the skeptics who say, well, where were all the hostile witnesses? James' point is correct. I mean, if they were hostile witnesses and they were talking about Jesus, they would probably be believers if they. I guess we'd like to have some witnesses that were earlier than what we have, but we don't. But the fact that Josephus was not a Christian. I guess let me take a step back. I'm not really making sense here. I'm agreeing with James, I guess, in saying that, you know, if somebody really had seen the miracles that were purported to take place, they probably would be believers.
But that
that
testimony Flavianum, the one we're talking about, where it says Jesus was one person through many people,
did 10,000 miracles.
That is heavily debated, and only the core of it, the bare bones of it.
But
is
even Wallace
not,
acknowledges that.
Exactly.
Even Wallace has acknowledged that.
That Christians went and spiced it up. Just like, give an example. How do we know this stuff is true and authentic? You have a 3-hour eclipse. Eclipses, we just had one recently. It lasts how long? 5 minutes?
No, it didn't say it was an eclipse. So it was dark for 3 hours.
For 3 hours, it's dark in midday.
It didn't say it was an eclipse.
Well, who cares what it was? It's not true. It didn't happen.
How do you know?
Because we can do astronomy and see there's no...
I was talking to someone just yesterday about Joshua and the sun standing still for a day, and they said, well, the sun does stand still for a day because it's sunny for a day, and then I think sometimes we try to work our little okay.
So has anyone here ever read Immanuel Velikovsky?
Read him the other day. No.
His work on Worlds in Collision and Earth in Upheaval. It's longer than I can go into right now, but he was a multidisciplined doctor and wrote these books in the 50s, which, you know, was castigated by the academic world because he went to the public. The short of it is, he is documented catastrophism and astronomy and comes up with some particular reasons as to why these events occurred within the memory of man. And those are the stories, the Exodus and things that are documented. So it's pretty interesting reading.
Let's do this real quickly. J. Warner Wallace was nice enough to interview. He heard about the club, and we made contact with him. Brady has interviewed him before, and he agreed to take our questions. How many of you put questions in? Chris did. Ken. Any Christians give any? No Christian questions?
No Christian.
So Brady interviewed him. We've got like 4 parts if we have time for all 4 parts. This first one is a long one. And so would you like to watch where he addresses us and tries to answer some of our questions? This is the author of our book, Cold Case Christianity. This is J. Warner Wallace.
Hi, I'm Brady Blevins with the Atheist Christian Book Club, a club that meets once a month to discuss the most important issues. We share a meal and have a respectful and thoughtful dialogue about the most important issues. This month we're looking at the book Cold Case Christianity and we have a very special guest with us. We have the author of Cold Case Christianity, J. Warner Wallace. He's also authored a couple of other books, God's Crime Scene, Forensic Faith, to name a few. And what's unique about him is he is a retired Los Angeles County cold case detective. In fact, you may recognize him. You may have seen him on the show Dateline. He's been featured on Dateline 5 times, more than any other cold case detective in the country. And J. Warner Wallace, I am excited to have you here today, man. Thank you for being here and being with us at our club.
Yeah, glad to be here. Looking forward to it. I have been all week.
Well, we've had a couple of questions come in from some of our club members, and so I want to go ahead and just jump right into it and start sharing these questions with you. The very first question, it's really a question that 2 of our guys had, but I'm going to go ahead and read. It's Bill Cluck. He's the co-founder of the Atheist Christian Book Club. And now, before I ask you this question, before I relay this question from Bill to you, I just got to let you know up front that Bill has an unreciprocated love from Bart Ehrman. And there's a whole backstory behind it. It's kind of been our little inside joke. So let me go ahead and read his question to you.
Okay.
And he said this. He said, given that the majority of scholars place the date of the Gospels from 30 to 60 years after Christ, why should you lean on your own understanding and not trust in Bart Ehrman?
Well, it seems I'm probably like a lot of your skeptics who are reading these books, is that you certainly wouldn't you wouldn't lean on the understanding of any expert I would trot out in front of you from the Christian side, and I would understand that absolutely. I mean, experts are looking at facts, and from those facts they're drawing inferences. So we could either look back at the facts together, or we could just trust on the inference made by an expert on one side or an expert on the other. In jury trials, we will bring experts in to speak in front of a jury. But in the end, the jurors don't really necessarily just consider, because remember, we're going to have an expert that's going to say the best inference from this evidence is this. And then the defense is going to draw an expert who's going to say, well, actually, no, the best inference from this evidence is something else entirely. So the juries have got to figure out, well, which of these two experts then should we trust? And how they're going to do this, they're going to go back to the facts, back to the evidences from which these two experts are drawing inferences to see if the evidence itself is worthy of the inference, or the inference is worthy of the evidence. So I would say that I'm not going to rely on experts to make my case. I'm going to go back to the evidence, and I'm going to do my best to make a reasonable inference from the data. So here, it's not so much that, remember, Bart had a mentor. Bart was trained up by one of the best biblical scholars of the last century. His name is Bruce Metzger. And Bruce was his mentor. He deferred a lot to Bruce. He thought the world of Bruce. He wrote a book with Bruce. He examined a lot of his first initial explorations were at the side of Bruce Metzger. And these two experts, with the exact same data points, the exact same manuscript evidence that they were looking at, Bruce was completely aware of everything that Bart is aware of. Bart is not aware of anything that Bruce wasn't aware of. And these two experts fall in entirely two different camps when it comes to their inferences from the manuscript evidence. Bart is a skeptic. He's not a Christian. Bruce was a very committed Christian and an ordained pastor as a result of his exploration. And when challenged on it, Bruce would say, look, I'm as skeptical as anybody. I have been skeptical my entire I've dug through this, and I believe it's true based on the evidence. So again, what we have here are, we can pull up any number of experts, and the very man that Bart relied on as his mentor doesn't believe the same things that Bart believes. So in the end, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back, regardless of what any expert says about the dating of the Gospels. I'm going to ask myself, well, what is that inference based on? What is the evidence that they are basing their inference on? I want to go back to that and see if I agree with the inference. Not so much. So I'm not really interested in what the inferences are. I'm interested in the data points from which we draw inferences.
Gotcha. Very good. We had two different club members. Chris and Ken both asked a real similar question, so I kind of merged their questions together. And it says this: if the same principles that guide cold case investigations are supposed to guide our investigation into the resurrection, why are there different standards for when supernatural causation should be considered?
Well, I'm not sure I understand what different standards are. I think that we look at cause and causes and causality, and we look at what the actual effects are, and we try to figure out which is the most reasonable cause that would explain these effects. So I'm not quite sure that there's a different standard necessarily.
Well, let me ask you this, and maybe this will help clear up the question.
Okay.
Have you ever appealed to a miracle to explain what happened in a cold case?
Okay, so what we do in all of our, looking at a set of evidences in a crime scene, is we begin with the simplest causal factors, and then we move toward those. And by the way, if the evidence does not point to those, the quickest, cops are lazy, I'll be honest with you. If we can take this guy to jail tonight, so if we get to a scene and we go, wow, this looks like somebody who lived with her, well, then we're looking at, is there some neighbor, or we're moving outside the simplest answer to the more distant answers. And at some point, we don't stop in that process until we hit an answer. And if we look at the first layer and we don't hit that answer, we move to the next layer. Now, so yes, and on my cases, they have all been explainable by the closest concentric layer to the victim. If I couldn't explain those things, well, then I'd have to assume something else. But in my cases, where I'm looking at created beings who are killing other created beings, the evidence always happens to point to a created being. So I'm able to stop at the most concentric circle. So yeah, am I open though to, look, at some point, if it cannot be explained by any physical process involving causal agents that are material, then of course I would have to jump to another level. but I've never had to do that in my cases because, again, we start at the most concentric and we work out from there. And I've always been, and once we hit a suspect that actually accounts for all the evidence, we stop looking.
Gotcha.
And so that's what we do, and that's what I've been able to do in all my cases. So yeah, I mean, it's not as though I'm opposed. Again, look, I'm not opposed to extranatural causes, but I don't run to extranatural causes. And I've been pretty consistent with this even in my life as a Christian, is that a lot of us as Christians will say, well, isn't God good that he did this? Or we assume God's supernatural activity is the direct first pusher over of dominoes in our lives, when in fact, this may be something way down the line. That's just there's both supernatural and natural activity we have to account for. I lived as a scientist for many years before the Enlightenment. Scientists considered both natural causes and supernatural beings, right? But we don't attribute everything immediately to God.
Exactly.
We start closest to the victim, basically, and we work our way out. And so I think that's what I try to do in my death investigations.
Very good, very good. Again, I'm Brady Blevins, and I'm here with J. Warner Wallace, the author of Cold Case Christianity, our book for the month. And Ken, another member of our club, asked this question.
Okay.
He said, there is a discrepancy in the resurrection accounts between Luke and Mark. Luke has the directive to stay in Jerusalem, but the other Gospels have the disciples meeting him in Galilee. What would you make of two eyewitnesses who disagreed on which end of the country a murder occurred?
Well, I think that's a very different claim to disagree on which end of the country a murder occurred and whether or not the disciples were either saw Jesus or were present in either Galilee or Jerusalem. So there's some basic principles that we see with eyewitness accounts. I never call these things discrepancies between eyewitness accounts when I'm working in crimes, like in homicides. The only thing I ever ask a dispatcher when being dispatched to a crime scene, it's the middle of the night, it's 2 a.m., I have to show up in a suit because detectives show up in suits, so it's going to take me a little while to get dressed. So I'm going to probably be an hour behind the call before I arrive at the crime scene. That's why sometimes, you'll be waiting around 2 hours for detectives to get someplace, because we're getting up in the middle of the night, driving in, trying to get dressed before we drive in. And the only thing I ever tell the dispatcher before I leave my house is, hey, I know there are officers there with the witnesses. Make sure they separate the eyewitnesses. And the reason why that's the only directive I give dispatch is because if I don't have those officers separate the eyewitnesses, I will get there and find that I have 5 or 6 identical eyewitness statements. And that is not what I want, because that's not what helps us solve the case. We're going to get there, and if they've been separated so they can't talk to each other, then we're going to get a great variation between the accounts. I don't care if it happened 2 hours ago or 25 years ago. You're going to have a great variation between the accounts. And there'll be places in the accounts where you're going to say, I'm not even sure how that is possible, that both these people think they're telling me something true. So you just learn how to work through the variations in the accounts. Now, I think there's probably even greater apparent variations than the ones that he's mentioning here. But so, for example, on this issue about when did he see the disciples? What exactly did he say to the disciples? Well, the problem we have is that in order for there to be a contradiction, he'd have to be making the exact same claim, stating that the exact same place, time, and people were involved in both of these accounts. And the problem we have is that we know from Acts 1 that Jesus hung around for 40 days. 5 weeks, right, or whatever it would be, that 40 days. He's hanging around for 40 days, and during that time, all the gospel writers have him appearing in a variety of places, including Galilee and Jerusalem. So the question simply becomes, are we saying that he said to be in Jerusalem at the same time? One gospel is, first of all, that assumes that Mark has no clue that Luke has no clue what Mark said, when in fact Mark is the most quoted line-by-line gospel in Luke's gospel. Luke says in the first verses that he was talking to all the people who he met through his journeys with Paul rather, and one of those people were all the eyewitnesses. Mark, for example, was one of the people we know that Luke had contact with, because Mark's gospel is quoted so often by Luke. Yeah. So are we suggesting that somehow Luke quotes Mark more than anyone else, yet he seems to get this detail wrong when apparently he had access to the detail? Why would he get it wrong? Well, I think there's something else at play here. It's not a matter of were they supposed to be in Galilee or Jerusalem. It's when were they in Galilee and Jerusalem. And if you look at that verse, there's a couple of ways to read that. Number one, was that an entire contiguous statement from Jesus about where to be when? Or is he talking about when you do get to Jerusalem, make sure that you wait there for me, or you wait for the Holy Spirit? So there's a lot of ways to read that. And unfortunately, I don't think that any one of those excludes. But let's just go to another principle beside that. Number one, I don't think they're both early accounts. And it's clear that Luke is familiar with Mark's account. I don't think we can say he just got that one detail wrong. He's describing something entirely different. And we know that all the disciples described Jesus in a variety of places over that 40 days in which he remained with the disciples. But more importantly, let's just say that there's something wrong. Now, I don't suggest there is, but let's just say there's a detail in the Gospels in which the author gets something wrong. Okay, it actually has got it's something that's factually incorrect. Now, I don't think that's the case. But even if that was the case, there seems to be an assumption then that, okay, if a witness gets one thing wrong, they're done, right? Actually, not in criminal trials. We actually have a jury instruction for this that says, hey, if witnesses can be wrong about a detail yet still be deemed reliable about the overall narrative, judges instruct juries on this, specifically saying just that. And we're asked to take a look and say, well, why do you think there's a discrepancy? Is there something that might explain why he's wrong about this one detail? They can't also be applied. I've had cases specifically where a woman got something wrong in her testimony, yet the jury found her reliable on the overall narrative because we have a jury instruction for that. Now, I don't think that's the case in Scripture, but even if it was, I don't think you have the necessarily intellectual wherewithal or the right to just kick everything to the curb. I think that, but again, I don't think that's actually the case. I think these are variances between eyewitnesses, and that's very common in my casework that I think we see between the Gospels.
Well, and I think
Well, do we have any, before we discuss that answer, do we have anything coming from our Facebook Live?
We do. We've had a couple of comments. I'm backing up here so I can get back to the beginning. The first one was, and this was a little while back, I apologize, why do you think a second ending was added to Mark? And then the same person said the fig tree story has an obvious symbolic message. Did the early readers of Mark think that really happened?
Was that the same person?
Yes.
Okay, and so the first part of the question was, why was there a longer ending?
A second ending to Mark.
A second ending to Mark.
Mm-hmm. And then the fig tree story, did they really believe that?
Did the fig tree withered?
He just said the fig tree story has an obvious symbolic message. Did the early readers of Mark think that really happened?
Maybe, do we know where this person's calling from? Or
Brian Duncan, I don't know if you know who that is.
Well, Brian, maybe meaning by that, was it purely symbolic rather than actually physically taking place? Was it just a, kind of like a parable or something?
Fig tree.
Fig tree, yeah. So, anybody want to comment on those two things, long ending of Mark
I think we're all presuming that the long ending of Mark was added later, but I'm not willing to totally automatically accept that. What that's based on is the manuscripts that they have, and the oldest manuscripts that we have don't have it in there, and then some later manuscripts did. Correct me if that's not what happens.
Yeah, there's some other issues about the type of Greek that you find as well. It doesn't look like the same author, but doesn't mean it couldn't have been the same author.
So it's very possible that it isn't.
But it's consensus that was added later. There's almost no debate.
And it's geographical.
I understand.
When it does start Mark 19 through 16 through whatever. When it starts popping in there, it's very localized, so we can trace it. And the rest, like the other side of the Mediterranean, Carthage and all that, they didn't even hear about it yet. And then it took a while to spread over. So yeah.
But where I went to seminary, Southeastern Seminary in Raleigh, or Wake Forest, North Carolina, they had a thing. Of course, our school was the only one that believed in the longer ending of Mark was authentic. Everybody, the broad consensus is that.
I'm surprised that Southeastern held to that.
Yeah. Well, they believed in that.
But anyway, I would think that that most evangelicals would hold to the long ending. Any modern Bible translation is going to make note of that. Make note of that distinction that it's probably not any. But I did want to clarify on that the short ending of the mark, the short mark that we do have does include the resurrection. It does include the empty tomb. So a lot of times people think, oh, they added the empty tomb part after the crucifixion.
Yeah, and not resurrection necessarily, but empty tomb and a bunch of women running away, vowing not to tell anybody.
Right. And the later gospel writers, Matthew and Luke, found that problematic, and they go, this isn't going to work. Let's go and have a fish fry at the Sea of Tiberias, John. Let's go and have the road to Emmaus. About the fig tree, Mark wrote that it wasn't even the season for figs. And what happened, Jesus just,
Would that be the criterion of embarrassment?
It would. And so what's interesting, though, here's the point.
That testifies to historicity.
The later gospel writers,
kind of does.
The later gospel writers saw that, gosh, the tree isn't even in season, and he's blowing it up.
Yeah.
So what they did is they took out it wasn't even in season to make Jesus look better. The later gospel writers.
How do you know they took it out?
Read your.
It's still in there.
It's still
Well, no,
in
used to the text that's not in there doesn't mean that they
He
took
means
it out.
other gospel accounts, not the
His
Mark's
assumption is
gospel.
that they're copying from
Yeah,
Mark.
they're copying Mark, and then they found that problematic, and they go and
So Matthew and Luke omit
take the that it wasn't in season to make Jesus look like, but not a total crackpot. Yeah.
I wanted to go ahead.
Oh no, I got 4 things. So once I get on a roll, go ahead now.
Well, I got a roll too because
Someone go first.
I was going to ask the question about the location of the post-resurrection appearances, and I just wanted to give more context to that because I think it's more of a difficult problem than he let on. The fact is that, and let me just read the whole question the long version that I originally proposed to, but before
We talked about the long ending of Mark. We might as well get the long Ken.
Yeah. So here was the question as I initially formulated it. One of the building blocks for the case for the resurrection is the claim the gospel writers or their associates were reliable eyewitnesses. Skeptics challenge this claim by pointing to discrepancies in the accounts, which I'm talking to him, which you turn around in favor of their authenticity by observing that the credibility of eyewitnesses' accounts is enhanced by minor differences that mitigates against the possibility of collusion. And he made that point. Yet some of the discrepancies are not minor, in particular the location of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances to his followers. Luke explicitly, more than once, as if to drive the point home in protest of another tradition, he precludes Jesus' appearances outside the environs of Jerusalem. Now the statement that I'm about to quote was on the day of the resurrection itself. They're in Jerusalem. And he says, I am going to send you what my Father has promised, but stay in the city, Jerusalem, until you have been clothed with power from on high. He's talking about Pentecost, which was 5 weeks later. Then also that same quotation or a variation of that is mentioned in Acts 1:4 as well. So twice he does that. Well, the other Gospels have him appear in Galilee. All the other Gospels have him. John has him appear in both places, but Mark, the first Gospel, has him appear in Galilee initially. Not to say there couldn't have been a Jerusalem appearance, but if you read Matthew, it looks pretty explicit that it had to be first in Galilee because he sends the women on their way, telling them to go ahead of him and meet him in Galilee. But I digress. In fact, Luke cleverly transforms Jesus' Markan command for his disciples to meet him in Galilee. And I'll quote that Markan command from Mark. He says, he has risen, he is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. So that's Mark. There you will see him just as he told you. But Luke, tracking in the same narrative, he's copying the same narrative that Mark, from Mark, what I just quoted. Instead of those words, he says, he is not here. Same words. He's not here. He has risen. All the same words so far. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee. Okay? The Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men. He must be crucified on the third day and be raised again. So there's a parenthetical digression. He's taken the command to tell them to go ahead of him into Galilee. And he's saying, remember, while you were in Galilee, I told you these things. Then they remembered his words. So So, and then I go on to say to Wallace, I say, you rightfully call us to notice details, for example, that the date of a Journey t-shirt could make or break the case for a testimony. That was in the book about, the date of the t-shirt. Yet you conspicuously fail to mention these all-important details that pit one evangelist against the others, maintaining that these differences only enhance the credibility of the Gospels. What would you make of two eyewitnesses who disagreed on which end of the country a murder occurred in? You would correctly conclude that either one or both are mistaken. Yet you give a pass to Luke for roundly contradicting the Gospel of Mark, even though the event he testifies to, the coming to life of a dead body, is far, far less routine than a murder.
Perfect example, Ken. The Christian account always gets the benefit of the doubt. Am I right?
Right.
So now, why did you find his answer any?
No, because here's the thing: if you had somebody who knew of a Galilean tradition and who wanted to turn that into a Jerusalem-only tradition, you would be hard pressed to do a better job than Luke did to try to preclude the possibility that anybody went outside. Twice he said explicitly, "Don't go outside of Jerusalem. Stay here until the coming of Pentecost." So it's sealed. It's hermetically sealed. There's no way out of it.
So, Jim, what did you have to say?
Oh, so let me make sure I got this right.
Mm-hmm.
Luke adds that parenthetical to plug a hole in a boat, just to fix.
Well, he's
to
tracking
fix something.
along. Yeah, he's copying from Mark.
Could it not be? I'm playing devil's advocate. Mm-hmm. Could it not be that he's just trying to clarify what Mark originally meant?
Well,
that he just left by omission.
If so,
you say devil's advocate.
It's an actual.
You mean God's advocate?
The devil's advocate?
No, it's an actual job description in the Vatican. Christopher Hitchens. Oh, we talked
Here's
about this
what's problematic, guys, is as Ken has articulated, these things are terribly nuanced, terribly complex. You got to be a biblical scholar a lot of times to figure this stuff out. And when he talks to these congregations, he talks all over the country. You have to book him like a year in advance. He's just hit a niche that he's running to the bank with. Okay, and the Christian congregations, you know this, are not sophisticated and not well read enough, and are just going to buy whatever he says. Am I right?
Yeah, but take back one thing, and that is about taking it to the bank. He makes very little money.
Okay.
His honorariums are very modest, and he does a lot of things for free.
But isn't that problematic because you don't have a sophisticated audience? I mean, they'll believe, just whatever he tells us.
You can't blame the messenger for the quality of the audience. Yeah. I mean, it's just like, sometimes it's a situation to where you feel like your job is to take them wherever they are and take them up a notch or two if you can.
But
so it's, so what are you saying? He should not speak to the issue?
Here's my message to J. Warner Wallace. Go to the Society of Biblical Literature and, tell them about these early dates, and he'll get laughed out.
Even Craig Evans, he'd get destroyed.
Destroyed. Oh, go ahead, Jim.
That kind of answers. I only have 3 then, and it's an embarrassment of riches. We're not going to have time for them all. You know what? I'm just going to do. I'm going to do Chris a kindness. I'm going to channel him. All right. So here's Chris can't be here tonight, but he took 30 notes, and we're going to do a series on this on our show. But this one,
his show is Atheist Edge. It's a podcast, and it's on YouTube.
He said, "I have not experienced God in my life. Other people have experienced God, but they have experienced Him differently, different ways." Let me skip to it. Okay.
This is Chris speaking?
This is Chris talking. The same type of experience has been attributed to different gods or spirits or otherworldly forces. This is why spectral evidence, and when Wallace was talking, I was thinking, because I got a criminal justice background, spectral evidence, which just falls under, is not admissible in court. So you can't apply the same.
Help us, what's spectral?
Yeah, I'm with
spectral evidence came out during the witch trials in Salem,
yep.
and it was basically you could have a dream or a vision that somebody was a witch, and you could enter that into evidence.
But that's a real narrow definition. But it can get broader than that, which I think this falls under.
Sort of like Christine Ford.
Oh, whoa.
We were wondering when that was coming.
We're going to split
kind of spectral.
It's not allowed in courtroom and not considered in criminal investigations because no one can agree on what supernatural is or how it operates. James and I, for like an hour before this show started, we talked about how would we even. He was trying to use the extraterrestrials as an analogy.
Go to that.
You're okay.
You're done.
Then we'll put a dog ear on that one.
But that's a big issue, is whether or not anything supernatural exists.
Yeah,
But is there anything spiritual?
This came up in the questions,
Not in
and,
this
and I have an analogy that I think helps put this in perspective, maybe not, but part of the question came up, have you ever, this was asked of J. Warner Wallace, have you ever appealed to a miracle when working a cold case? He would not even consider that a possibility. He talked about those concentric circles and things like that, but I think what the part maybe that I would emphasize on that is, are you investigating the possibility of a supernatural event? Because you handle that differently. Let me give you an example. I visited several times in Roswell, New Mexico, the Alien Museum.
Yes.
And they have all this evidence for aliens. I am not a believer in that. You know, I didn't find it compelling. It was kind of funny to me, you know. And I never look at aliens as a possible explanation for things that I see. Now, however, let's say I'm assigned as a government commission to investigate what really happened at Roswell. Now, I would still be prejudiced against it, but I would have to try to set that aside and go in there and say that at least theoretically think there's a possibility that there was something supernatural. And I would be working maybe a little extra hard to prove it wasn't, but not supernatural, but something alien took place there.
Fringe.
But then, even if I came away thinking, man, I was convinced by the evidence now, I don't think it's ever happened before or since, but in this one case, I really think there might have been something alien. I don't go out of that room and then everything I think, was it aliens? Was it aliens? Was it aliens? No. But if you're going to investigate the possibility of a resurrection, when you already by definition know that miracles don't happen, you can't be unbiased. You would never be seated on a jury. Once you acknowledge that you're that biased against it, no jury would accept
Well,
you to sit on the
that's
jury.
the same old Christian. You just have this anti-supernatural bias. Let me give you a
Is that a
scenario.
confession?
Yeah, no. Let me give you a scenario. You're watching TV. You see this big gorilla going up a New York skyscraper. What do you assume? Oh my gosh, I'm watching CNN. No! You go, I'm watching a rerun of Godzilla, or I'm watching the science fiction natural. And then, you know, what are you going to say? Oh, there you go again with that anti-monster bias. We know monsters don't
There's
do
some
that.
logical fallacy somewhere.
Or the
Yes.
pyramids, you know,
That doesn't-
you can't
It's not-
explain how the pyramids got
Fallacy
built,
of
and so
analogy.
some people think that they were built by extraterrestrial assistance.
Well, I would tend to not believe that, but let me just say, if I was actually trying to investigate it in an unbiased way, I would at least have to acknowledge that the possibility is out
Right.
there.
Well,
But here's why my analogy I think is a little better, because extraterrestrials are still within the realm of the natural and observable. We have tools for determining that. We can keep a more open mind. My analogy was ghosts. That's the spectral evidence.
But here's
That's
the problem,
supernatural.
though.
And there we have no tools. Even if I was assigned, like you're assigned to the ET Commission, I'm assigned to the Ghost Commission, and so now I got you already have all your forensic tools. You got a whole armada of things at your disposal. I don't even know what tools to start with.
What you call Ghostbusters.
Right, and you know those backpacks. What are those even?
Unlicensed thermonuclear device.
By the way, this
How do you remember?
this was addressed centuries ago. They had a group of German scholars, Bolton and so forth, who were called the demythologizers. So they looked at the feeding of the 5,000. One of the greatest German scholars of the last century and this century. You look at the miracles. You look at the resurrection. You look at all those things. You just throw those miracles out, and you look at things like when in Mark 6, where they go, his family goes, Jesus can perform any great miracle. Well, that's believable. That's probably historical.
This greatest German scholar threw all the miracles out because
That's just what they did.
because miracles don't happen.
Yes, yes.
That's what Jason said.
It's just like that anti-monster. Oh, there you go again with that anti-monster bias. It's just, we
The
have
ghost
a
thing is
reason.
good though, Jim. The ghost thing is really good.
Yeah, but James, that goes back to
Okay,
James
King
point.
Kong,
One
yes,
thing,
sorry.
before we take the break, I'll just say the thing that I found problematic about ghosts, I like it except for this. I think a lot of atheists would just say, yeah, it's just like ghosts. You can rule it out without looking at it.
Which goes to your point.
Exactly.
At least
So,
have an open mind about
you
it.
have
right?
to,
Yeah.
if you're going to investigate and sit on that jury, you've got to
Yeah.
at least say, I'm going to be open-minded. to
But
the
spectral
possibility
evidence is
of
not admissible in court, nor is secondhand hearsay, which,
Right.
and now I'm not going to argue about if the Gospels are autographs or if they're actually attributed to the Mark,
Well, they're
Matthew,
not
Luke, John.
autographs. They're
No, if they're actually attributed to who they say
who
they
they
are.
were written by.
Yeah.
But
We can
but-
address this after the break, but that's very good. Look, we're gonna take about 10 minutes. We have time for, I think there's coffee. Do we have dessert in there?
Nope, no dessert.
Any extra pizza left over?
There is lots of pizza left.
Let me just say, before we do the break, let me just say, I want to say my appreciation to Conrad for
Yes.
providing the meal. Where did you go?
He went home.
Oh, did you have to go home? Okay.
Where's Justin? Oh, there he is.
I'm back here hiding.
Okay. So anyway, so we're going to take about a 10-minute break and then come right back.
I promise I'll shut up for the next half.
Don't let
That
Bill
was
have any sugar
I
or
wanna
caffeine
talk
on the
more
break.
about
You can. No, that was good.
So